Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Just in case you were wondering what the heck Jerry Kajak was doing in the middle of the second lesson, Jerry was reading a part of the story of Pentecost in Ukrainian. Rose read a part of the same story in French. Abe read a part of it in Spanish. Therese read a part of it in Creole. Shus read a part of that story in a language called Hebrew. Eden read a part of that story in a language I mispronounced tree. I'm sorry, Eden. In case you were wondering what Carol was doing during the lesson, Carol was reading a part of the story in an exotic language called English. And hearing the story of Pentecost read in those 7 different languages illustrates something about the story. The story of Pentecost is the story of a story being told in many different languages. The story is set in Jerusalem during the Jewish feast of Pentecost. And the streets of Jerusalem are mobbed with people who have come from all over the world to celebrate that festival. People from all over Asia and Arabia and Persia and Africa and Europe. And they're speaking all kinds of languages in the street. Now, most of those people were Jewish. The rest were converts to Judaism. So all those people would have had one language in common, Hebrew. But by the first century, Hebrew was to Jewish people all over the world what Latin later was to Roman Catholics all over the world. They all knew it, but it wasn't their first language. It was their holy language. It was the language they used in the synagogue and the temple. It wasn't the language they used in the street or at home. Their everyday language, the language they used at home or in the street or at work, was the language native to the place where they happened to live. Whether they happened to live in Rome or somewhere in Greece or somewhere in Asia or anywhere else. Even in Israel, Hebrew was not spoken in the street. When Jesus taught in the streets and spoke to his disciples directly, he did not use the language of the temple. He spoke the language everyone else did in Israel when they weren't in the temple. He used the vernacular language of Aramaic. So, there the crowds were in the streets of Jerusalem, speaking their many different languages of the street. And meanwhile, the disciples were cloistered in a house, waiting for Jesus to return to them as he had promised. And then he returns to them, just as he promised. He returns to them in the Spirit. And the first thing he does when he returns to them is he moves them out of the house. The Spirit drives them into the street and gives them each a gift. Each of the disciples are miraculously able to speak a different language. They are each able to tell the story of Jesus in a language that the people on the streets can understand. And that's the story of Pentecost. That's the birth of the mission of the church. And that's a work of the Holy Spirit who moves or motivates the community out of the cloister and into the world, and inspires or empowers the members of that community to communicate what they've received inside the house, outside the house. That is not a one-day event. That is a continuing event. And the 7 languages we heard this morning illustrate it. There is a man in the church this morning who can tell the story in Hebrew only because the Holy Spirit at some point motivated somebody to go to Nigeria and to tell the story of Jesus in Hebrew. There is a woman in the church this morning who can tell the story in Tree only because the Holy Spirit motivated someone at some point to go to Ghana and tell the story of Jesus in Tree. are men and women in the church this morning who can tell the story in English only because at some point the Holy Spirit motivated someone to go to the place we now call England and tell the story to the people who were then called Angles in a language the pagan Angles could understand. And as far as we know, those Latin-speaking missionaries were not given the gift of tongues. They had to learn English the hard way. They had to go to the Angles first, not as their teachers, but as their students. Those missionaries had to go to what we call England and sit at the feet of the English pagans and listen to the pagans speak to them. Before they could tell the story of Jesus to the pagans, they had to let the pagans tell their story to them in their own language so that they could learn their language, so that at some point they would be able to translate the story of Jesus into their language. Okay, that's why there is such a thing as English-speaking Christians today, and Ukrainian-speaking Christians today, and French and Spanish-speaking Christians today. The translating in those cases was done without the gift of tongues. Instead of the gift of tongues, the translators in those cases had to rely on other gifts of the Holy Spirit. Like, for instance, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Do you recognize that list? That's what Paul calls the fruit of the Spirit. Those are the gifts the Spirit gives us and then matures in us so that we can faithfully convey the gospel. And without those gifts, what does the gift of tongues communicate? Without those gifts, St. Paul says, all our words, true though they may be, wise though they may be, very articulate though they may be, without those other gifts, our words are just noise. Religious noise, which is probably the worst kind of noise of all. Without the spiritual gift of love, for instance, St. Paul says, all our words are just clanging cymbals. If this church were to send English-speaking missionaries all the way to the end of the block to convey the gospel to the people of Troy, what kind of translating would those missionaries need to do? Okay, people of Troy already know English, and they don't lack for English Bibles or English-speaking churches or English-speaking preachers. What they lack are English-speaking missionaries who are willing to dwell with them and learn to love them and learn to listen to them tell their own stories in their own words and to learn the language they speak when they talk about their own lives. At home, at work, in the street, their struggles, their sorrows, their hopes, their disappointments, their successes, their failures. And then having listened to them speak in their own language, to translate the gospel back into that language. If we don't do that translation, all we've got for the world is noise. Do you think the world needs more noise? The strangest thing about the story of Pentecost is the gift of tongues. Because the gift of tongues wasn't necessary. All the people in the streets of Jerusalem that day knew Hebrew. All the disciples knew Hebrew. The disciples could have said everything they needed to say in Hebrew, and they would have been perfectly understood. As a matter of fact, wouldn't it have been more appropriate that day to tell the story of Jesus using the holy language? And yet, for some reason, the Holy Spirit chose that day to give them the gift of tongues. I think maybe for two reasons that day. First, and most obviously, because the gospel wasn't just for the Hebrew-speaking people of the world, any more than it remains just for the English-speaking people of the world. The gospel was to be carried, starting that day, beyond the people who happen to speak Hebrew, beyond the boundaries of Israel, into the world, to the Gentiles, to the nations, to every family, race, and nation, and language. The giving of the gift of tongues that day, on the day of Pentecost, anticipates that story being told to the ends of the earth. But I think there's at least one other reason why God chose not to use Hebrew that day in Jerusalem. And I think it's because there is something about the gospel that can't be communicated in the holy language. I think there is something fundamentally vernacular about the gospel of Jesus. And it loses its voice when it's cloistered in the synagogue, or the temple, or the church. It wants to get out of the house and into the streets because it speaks directly to ordinary life and the way ordinary people live in the real world. The gospel itself communicates life, real life, as it's lived in the real world. That's the language it was written in. That's the language Jesus spoke when he spoke Aramaic. He was speaking in the vernacular. He was actually speaking profanely, in the old-fashioned sense of the word profane. He was using the common tongue. Okay, the language people use when they're just being themselves. The language people use when they're being real. When they drop all their pretenses and just tell it like it is. That's how God speaks to his people. That's how we're invited to speak to him. Using the language that just blurts out of our mouths, unrehearsed, when we are genuinely happy, or genuinely sad, or genuinely angry, or really scared, or really in trouble, or really in need. When we're going through things that are hard to talk about. When we're going through things we don't even know how to talk about. When we're going through things we don't even have words to describe. Okay. When we are going through things for which we have no words, then we are speaking the language of the Holy Spirit. St. Paul says, the Holy Spirit intercedes for us with groans, inarticulate groans, deep groans, he says, too deep for words. That's the language into which God translates our needs and our stories. Okay, you know, St. Francis famously said, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. And it is sometimes necessary to use words. They just need to be translated into love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. That's the language that truly tells the story of Jesus. Isn't that the language the world is waiting to hear us use? Isn't that the language the city of Troy is waiting for someone to speak? Isn't that the language our families need to hear us speak? Isn't that the language we need to hear each other speak inside the church? If we don't know how to speak that way, God will give us tongues. The gift of tongues is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and it's given like every other spiritual gift at our baptisms. We just need to learn how to exercise it. We learn first by listening to the language our neighbor speaks.